so they weaned it down to 180, but they found like, way more photos. And so when they did the search in his house, family members and friends, asked him, like, what about these photos? And he basically said that because he was a car mechanic, he told them that basically the photos were left, in cars, and he just happened to have them, and that's why. Like, he didn't admit that he was taking photos, even though he definitely had a bunch of cameras and things like that. So, no, he didn't admit anything. I mean, all he admitted to his friends was that he's a philanderer. I mean, he admitted that he had a lot of girlfriends. He bragged about having numerous girlfriends. I mean, he was married at the time when he was caught. He had been married for 32 years. He was a grandfather, but he told some of his friends that, he had a number of girlfriends over the years, and then he also, picked up girls on the streets, and, he had nicknames for them and stuff like that. So he was quite a bragger when it came to, his love life. Besides, the murders, of course. He didn't talk about those.
What drew you to this case? I mean, and at what point did you kind of decide to really invest as much time and energy into it as you did? I mean, I personally would have a really hard time with a case like this.
Well, I mean, it just kind of fell in my lap, really. I mean, I found out about it through the coroner's office. I used to go over to the coroner's office all the time, and I talked to the coroner there and asked him, if there was any cases over the weekend, that I should write about. And one of the times I was over there, he basically said that the coroner's office had started the serial killer task force to look into these body dumps, which were, basically women that were found dead around South Los Angeles and all over LA County. Some of the women were found in parks, some of them in, fields, some of them in alleyways, some of them in garbage dumpsters. And they found 38 women between 2002 and 2006. And so the coroner's office decided to look into it to see if there was any links, if there was a serial killer. And I mean, they tried talking to the police, and a lot of the police were just like, mind your own business, you're the coroner. You don't need to worry about, homicides, things like that. And so he actually told me how they were looking into this. And so I asked him, how it was going, and he said that, they were overwhelmed by so many cases. I mean, at the coroner's office, they have like, 10, 30, up to 30 cases a day, so all the investigators were really busy, and they didn't have time to look into these cases. And so I kept bothering him about it, just asking him, like, what's the progress? Have you found anything? And he said, they really hadn't been able to start looking at it. And so I was like, let me look at it, I'll look into it. And he was like, no. But finally, after a few months, he actually gave me the list of 38 women. And so at that point, I didn't know anything. And, so I just started calling all the law enforcement agencies, because the women were found all over LA County. So there was like Downey Police, LAPD, LA County law enforcement agencies that had some of these cases. And so I started calling them all to see if there was any connection, if they thought there was any connection, if any of the cases had been solved. And I mean, in some of the cases, they had a case where a woman was found burned to death in a car, and it turned out that she was with a John, and she had died of an overdose, and he didn't want to take her to the hospital or anything, so he actually started the car on fire and tried to burn her because he was hoping that his DNA wouldn't be left on her.
Oh, there you go.
So
wow.
That's a great solution.
Yeah, no, and so there was other cases, actually a couple of the cases were like natural causes and, things like that. And some of them were, the boyfriend killed the woman, sort of thing. But as I was going along, I got to the 37th case, and it was Princess Berthomew, and she was a 15-year-old runaway from Inglewood, which is kind of next to Los Angeles in LA County. And I ended up finally talking to the Inglewood detective that was working on the case, and he told me that her case, which was in 2002, was linked to a case in 2003, and that was an LAPD case, and those two cases were linked to a series of 25 caliber murders back in the 80s. And so he was the one who actually told me about this link. And then I found out, I ended up writing a story about it, but, the police basically didn't tell anyone in the community. Like, no one knew. Like, none of the family members knew. I mean, I was sort of the first one, I was the first one to tell some of the family members that their daughters had been killed by a serial killer. And so I ended up, I kept looking into it. And then basically about a year later, I found out that the killer had struck again in 2007. And at that point, the LAPD decided to like admit, that there was a serial killer out there, and then they had a task force going, and the city council put a $500,000 reward looking for information. And I don't know, I mean, it was something that I was fascinated with, and I was hoping that they would, catch the guy. And I mean, one of the victims, her and I would drive around the neighborhoods together, trying to find the house, because there was one survivor in 1988, and he picked her up at a liquor store and then told her she was going to a party. He said he was going to drive her to the party, but instead he stopped at, he said it was his uncle's house, but the police believe he went into the house, got a gun, went out and shot her about 2 minutes later. And she actually was able to, back in 1988, she took the detectives back to this house, which was owned by a guy named Otis White, and it turned out that it was 3 doors down from where Lonnie Franklin, the killer, lived. Wow. And so her and I, on a number of occasions, like drove around the streets looking for the houses, the house. And so, on a number of occasions we did that. And she was like, it was a side door and it was white. And, there's like a zillion houses that, have an entrance to the side and that are white. So, we went around and we did some interviewing together, as well as I tried to find out my own stuff. And I got a lot of people contacting me, like psychics. And I had a few people that believed that their friend or their husband were the killer. And I ended up getting like DNA from them to take it to the police. So it was kind of crazy at times.
Yeah. Now the victim that you were just talking about, that's Miss Washington, correct?
Yeah, Nitria Washington. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. She was the sole survivor.
And that was, what year was that attempt made? That was the 80s, right?
It was November 1988.
Okay.
So that does lead us into another question. She's the only surviving witness, but what I've always wondered about when I was reading about Lonnie, and of course then, the other serial killer cases is, and this is just your opinion, is really what I'm after here, but how is it that nobody saw him? Like, there was no witnesses to what he was doing?
Well, and it ended up that, he had his trial last year and he got convicted, and during the death penalty, another woman came forward and said that she was also a victim of his, so there's actually possibly 2 survivors. And she actually said that she was at a bus stop, and it was about 10 o'clock, because a lot of the victims, like Anitri, it was late at night. With this woman, Laura Moore, it was late at night. She was at a bus stop. He drives up, he drove up to both of them and just said, hey, could I give you a ride? And Anitria actually talked to him for a few minutes before she got into the car. And Laura Moore actually turned him down, and he just kept going around until finally she got in the car with him. And then he takes them right to an alley. And a lot of the victims, were picked up late at night. And I think that's why there wasn't any witnesses. There was one witness, alleged witness, actually, for the Bernita Sparks. She was one of the victims. And one woman said she thought that she saw Bernita Sparks that night getting into the car with somebody. But, a lot of them was like, I think the only reason, a lot of it was that it was late at night and there wasn't a lot of people out on the street.
Yeah, I think
that's why. And and also too, he knew what he was doing. So, he's going to be stealthy, right? He's not going to do it when there's 100 people around. He's going to make sure it's late at night. And when the police were following him around, after they got the familial DNA from the son, the match with the son, they followed him around, and he left his home one night. He went to 42nd and Western, which was like kind of a popular prostitution hangout, and there was 2 girls standing on the street, and it was really secluded. The detectives, there was this undercover cop following him, and he made a point to say to the detective, he's like, I'm afraid that he's going to find out that I'm following him, because there was like literally no one on the street. So he picks times when there's not a lot of people around. That's why I think there's no witnesses. And then he brings them to alleyways, and not a lot of people hanging out in the alleyways at 4 o'clock in the morning.
Do you think their line of work had something to do with the lack of witnesses as well? That maybe, people that were around were other women who were prostitutes or whatever, and weren't paying so much attention to the fact that he might just get in a car with a John?
Well, I think it was, some of the girls definitely had prostitution records, but some of them, Deborah Jackson, she was gay, and she was just taking a bus, to her home, where she was living. How he came across her, it's hard to say. Laura Moore was picked up at a bus stop. And Eatria was at a liquor store. So it's hard to say whether any of the girls were like on a stroll, because a lot of the girls, like, you have to remember back then it was like the crack cocaine era, and so a lot of the girls weren't like technically prostitutes. Like, they'd walk up, down the street, some guy would pull up and he'd be like, hey, do you want to smoke some crack? And the girls were so doped up, they're like, sure, and they just jump in the car and then he'd drive off. It wasn't like standing on a corner with 10 girls, you know what I mean?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So, it appears then he did actually probably hook some of them in by offering them drugs instead of cash?
Oh, for sure. I mean, yeah, I think he definitely did that. And I mean, he, according to what the police told me, I mean, he didn't smoke and he really didn't drink very much himself, but he knew that, he could lure girls in with drugs. So I think that that's exactly what he was doing. I mean, I know that he was also paying some girls, because there was a videotape that the prosecutor showed during his trial, and he videotaped this girl, and it looked like she had no idea he was videotaping her, and she kind of comes out of this bathroom, and she's got a t-shirt on and jeans, and then she takes her jeans off, and, he tells her to take her top off, so she takes her top off, and he's taking photos of her, and then they do like a sex act, and then he sort of just puts some money on this table, just really like nonchalantly just puts some money on the table, and then she just sort of, while she's talking to him, sort of reaches her hand up, grabs the money, puts it in her pocket. They talk for a few minutes, and then he turns off the video when she goes into the bathroom, and then that's that. So yeah, he was definitely paying some of the women.
So he didn't videotape himself committing any of the murders, did he?
No, they didn't find.
Yeah.
They didn't find, but they found. So most of the videos, actually, he wasn't in the videos. It was mostly women in the videos, like doing, dancing for him or touching themselves or whatever the scenario was, and you could see his hand, but they only had like one or two videos where he actually was in it. So he was smart.
Were most of the women in the videos, were they his victims, or were they women who turned out to be found alive and well?
Well, some of them, like, they never identified the both of them, but they did find they found a photo of Anitra Washington, who was the survivor. They found a photo of Genethia Peters, who was his victim in January 1st, 2007, the last known victim. And they also found the IDs, like a driver's license and a student identification of two women that went missing in 2005, Ayala Marshall and Rolina Morris. Both women went missing right near, they were known to hang out around Franklin's house on around 81st and Western, and they found their identification tucked in an envelope along with like Genethia Peters' photo in this mini fridge in his garage.
But none of the video was of any of the women that were confirmed his victims. Is that correct?
That's right. Okay. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So I one of the questions I wanted to ask you, and this relates to both Lonnie and the Daytona Beach serial killer, is their hunting grounds is the term I'm going to use, and how far they roam from essentially their home base. Because
not very far.
Well, Lonnie, yeah, he didn't seem to go very far afield, which feels weird to me. I mean, he's what, like a mile or 3? Is that about how far he roamed?
I think the farthest victim was about 5 miles away. But yeah, no, he hunted in his own backyard. And that's like, most serial killers do that. I mean, they had, back in the 80s in South Los Angeles, there was, 6 serial killers operating at the same time. And they were able to identify all of them, actually. And all of them lived in South Los Angeles. I mean, Chester Turner was one of the serial killers, and he hunted like literally within 2 blocks of where he lived with his mother. They like familiar territory. They don't want to be surprised. They want to know. Lonnie was a garbage man, and he knew the alleyways, like he knew the dumpsters of South Los Angeles, because that's where he worked, right? So they want to feel comfortable. So that's why most serial killers actually operate, in the same area where they dump their bodies.
I was always kind of wondering too if one of the reasons they do it is they're just trying to clean up the neighborhood. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I don't mean that in a harsh, judgmental way, but I mean, seriously, is that possibly a motivator for some of these guys, that they're they don't really approve of that activity, and they'd like to see it sort of discouraged.
Well, I mean, obviously that was the case for Lonnie. I mean, it's obvious he considered the women trash, right? And so he dumped their bodies in trash, so he considered them trash, and his wife was there, in dumpsters, and his wife was very religious. So maybe there was something for him, I think he had this like compulsion, I think that he couldn't control himself. I mean, he was always after women, he was like addicted to women. And I think that in his case, he also had this deep-seated hatred. And, where it came from, it's hard to say, because it seemed like he had a good relationship with his mother and his sister, so it's hard to say exactly how he ended up, hating women so much. But, I think that's what he thought. I think he thought he was cleaning the streets.
Yeah.
Crazy. Okay, so let's back up a little bit. Because I realize we haven't asked this question yet. Where did the name The Grim Sleeper come from?
My editor and I made it up.
Oh.
Good one. Score.
She was, when I told her about the story, we were writing the story, and she was like, we have to name him. And I didn't want to name him, actually. I was like, no, I don't think that's right to do that. And she said, yes, I think, you should, and everything like that. And we decided that it was a good idea, just because, a lot of the serial killers out there, like Son of Sam and, all these guys, Zodiac, I think that they're known because they were nicknamed, right? So everyone knows about them. And in this case, I didn't want this case to go away. Like all of a sudden you get media attention, and then the next day nobody cares. And so our hope was that by nicknaming him, people would remember the name and they couldn't forget about the case. And so her and I started, trying to go through different names. And she was like, Ripper Van Winkle was one of the ones she was on. And we were like, no. And I was like, what? And then I was like, what about Grim Sleeper because of the break in the case? She was like, yes. I'm like, no. I was kidding. I hate that name. And then she's like, no, we're calling him that.
Too bad.
You should have
called. Too bad, exactly.
Was it? I can't tell when you're done talking when you just dropped out because of Skype. hopefully you're done. I was going to say you should have named it the Tooth Fairy after the serial killer in Red Dragon.
Cool.
I don't know if you ever read that book or not.
No, but I heard about him actually.
Yeah. But the Tooth Fairy, what was great about that is they called him the Tooth Fairy, and it really made the killer angry. And then he sort of contacted the reporter. In a kind of brutal way.
So it's probably good that you didn't.
Probably good that you didn't actually make him mad.
Here is really what we're getting at.
Yeah.
So with Lonnie now, Lonnie took what was it, a 14-year break? Is that correct?
Well, at first they thought it was a 13-and-a-half-year break, but then they found a victim in 2000, so it was 10 years now as opposed to like 13 and a half.
It might keep narrowing too.
Well, that was my question is, we hear about stories like Lonnie where somebody is supposedly taking a break. Do you think that he actually took a break, or do you think that it just happened to be that we haven't been able to draw the links from found victims to him or victims that weren't found?
See, that'd be my guess.
The detectives definitely don't think that he took a break. They think that, because two of the victims, Bernita Sparks and Janisha Peters, were found in dumpsters by, homeless people looking for like recyclables and stuff like that. And so there was a good chance that they would have ended up in a landfill. So the detectives think that a lot of his victims ended up in landfills. Because they think like he's known to have killed 15 women, but they think it's probably closer to 30. And that some of the women, are in landfills right now. So I don't know. Like, I think that, I know that there was a case in 2000. So, his last known victim was in 1988, and then there was a case in 2000. During the 90s, it was also a time when his kids would have been teenagers, so, who knows? Maybe they were like, Dad, what are you doing leaving the house at 3 o'clock in the morning? Like, where are you going? Like, I don't know if there was something going on in his family life that, stopped him from doing it. Because, for example, like Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, he would stop at times too, when he was happy in his relationship. So I think sometimes these like serial killers, they might stop if they're happy in their relationships. Like maybe Lonnie was happy and with a girl he was dating. Who knows? But the cops don't actually think that he did. But it's hard to tell. So I'm not really sure. But he did. He was definitely. I mean, there was a flurry, right, from 1985 to 1988. Then all of a sudden, there's not a lot going. But then again, in 1988, they had a suspect, a sheriff deputy named Ricky Ross. So maybe he decided to lay low because they were focused on this, deputy.
He was probably hoping.
It's hard to say.
Probably hoping the deputy would take the fall for it, and it never wound up happening.
Well, the deputy actually got arrested and charged with the murder, these 3 unrelated murders, but the detectives actually thought that he was responsible for the 25 caliber murders because he admitted that he owned a 25 caliber gun. But it ended up that the ballistics didn't match with this gun that they found in his car, and the bullets that were pulled out of these 3 prostitutes that were killed around the same time Anitria was attacked. So they ended up dropping the case, but the detectives actually believed, up until I talked to one of the detectives back in 2006, and he still believed it was Ricky Ross who was the deputy. So I think that Lonnie for a while there probably thought that they were focused on somebody else, so he was going to lay low.
Now, Lonnie would eventually get caught because of familial DNA, but did they ever find his gun, that 25 caliber that he was using on all these girls? I don't remember seeing anything that ever actually got found.
Well, they didn't find the gun that he used for the victims from 1985 to 1988, but when they searched his home, they found the gun that was used to kill Janisha Peters, the 2007 victim, and that gun was also used. They found after they arrested him and charged him with the 10 murders, they ended up finding out that he was also responsible for this 1984 murder. They found Smoot, the bullet that was pulled out of her. So the gun that they found in one of his Janisha Peters. So they did find one of the guns, and they found a receipt for the gun they think was used to kill the other victims in the 80s, but they never found that gun.
Okay. Now, also when I was doing the reading, I know that there's a lot of controversy around the use of familial DNA, and what is the uproar about that? I personally don't get it.
Well, I think that a lot like ACLU and civil liberty organizations and civil rights organizations, they believe it's an invasion of privacy, and they think that it unfairly targets minorities, because there's more minorities like African Americans, Hispanics, etc. in prison. So they're saying that it unfairly targets that population. England did a study many years ago, and they found that if you're for the familial DNA, because as you know, Lonnie, they had his DNA, but Lonnie had never gone to prison, so he had never been swabbed. So that's why they didn't know who he was, but they knew he was matched to the victims in the 80s and the victims in the 2000s because of they found saliva on many of the women's breasts. And so they knew he was, there was one killer, but because he wasn't in any felon data bank, they couldn't find him. So that's why they decided to use that familial DNA. And it was the first time actually in California, actually in the U.S., that they used familial DNA testing to find a serial killer. And they checked it in 2008. And how it goes with the familial DNA, it had been, England had been using it for many years. And basically they said that if you're a felon, there's a 40% chance that you're going to have a male relative, like a cousin, an uncle, a brother, a father, who's a felon. So if you're not in the data bank, there's a 40% chance that you're going to have a relative who's in the data bank.
That makes sense.
And so that's why they did it in 2008, and it came back nothing. And then they did it 2 years later, and the felon data bank had grown 400,000. And so they did it again, and Lonnie's son, Christopher, had been charged with carrying a weapon, and he pled guilty. And as a result of his plea, he got swabbed, and that was in 2009. So he was in the system for, just close to a year, before they did that second DNA swab, and it came back as a match to him. But they knew it wasn't him because he would have been about 2 years old when the murder started. So they knew right? So they knew he had to be, they knew he was related to the killer. And so they actually looked for any relative, and there was an uncle. Well, they thought there was an uncle in Rancho Cucamonga, but they ended up checking checking it out and finding that there was no relation. And then they found out that his father, Lonnie, lived like on 81st and Western, which was like at the epicenter of where all the murders took place. And so that's why they ended up, following, Lonnie. And after 3 days, they got his DNA off a pizza slice. He went with his girlfriend to a pizza parlor.
I read about that in one of the articles. Yeah, on an LAPD cop impersonated a waiter or something like that.
Busboy, and went around and had like a bus bin, and half the stuff was Lonnie's and the other half was, just people at the table. And it was like a kiddies, birthday party for kids, and kids were running around eating pizza. So the cop, just went and grabbed his dishes, and they had a plate with a piece of cake on it, and they were able to get the swab from a hardened piece of cheese from the pizza.
Nice.
Yum. So did I hear you correctly refer to some psychics that were involved in this case?
Well, I had when the story broke in 2000, I did another story. I did one in 2006 and I did one in 2008, and that's when we nicknamed him the Grim Sleeper. So I ended up getting a lot of calls from people, and a few of them I got were from psychics, and one of them was this woman who believed that, she knew who the killer was, and he was killing women. He was a really good-looking guy, and she said he was like a cross between, what was his name? What's his name? The tennis, not the tennis player. She said he was a cross between Tiger Woods and I forget who the other person was. She said he was a cross between, and she said that he was a lawyer. His wife didn't know.
Damn it.
His wife didn't know. I know. Now I'm gonna have to look through my book to see what I wrote. For some reason I can't remember. But yeah, so I had a few people that did that. I had this one woman who contacted me and said that she believed that her husband was a killer, but she didn't really have any good reason.
Yeah, I think she just kind of felt he was shady, wasn't it? Something like that?
Well, I mean, it was more of like this gut feeling, she said, and she was like, I just want to make sure. And I said, well, just, talk to the police. And she's like, no. And she was afraid that the police would basically, target him and whatever. And so she was like, if I get DNA, will you give it to the cops or test it? And I'm like, well, we don't test DNA at the LA Weekly. And I said, but I guess. And I said, I could give it to the police. And I just thought, I was getting a lot of calls. Like, you end up, I talked to so many people who I thought they were like, oh my God, it's so-and-so. And you're completely convinced. You're like, oh my God, it's got to be this person. And then all of a sudden, the next thing out of their mouth is that, the FBI is tapping their phone and the CIA is knocking on their door. And you're like, oh, for God's sake, you had me for the, so this woman, I didn't think I'd get a call back. And she called me back and she was like, can we, meet up? I have his, DNA. And so I ended up meeting up with her, and she told me, she passed me. It was like a Jason Bourne thing. And I met her on a bench near work, and she sat down next to me and passed me this bag. And in there, she was like, it's a cup, and inside there's like the napkin, and she said it was a napkin, and she said it was semen on it. And I was like, oh my God, I thought it was supposed to be like a saliva sample. And she's like, no. I was like, oh no. And so I ended up calling the detective who was the main detective on the case, and I said, this is what I have. And all of a sudden there was like complete silence on the line. And I'm like, what am I, it was like 100 degrees in LA, and I'm like, what do you want me to do? Can I drop it off? He's like, I'm out of town. He's like, put it in your fridge. And I'll do the LAPD the next morning or whatever. And I'm like, put it in my fridge. He's like, yeah, put it next to your like veggies. And I'm like, oh my God.
So
I ended up putting it in next to the
Was it at least like sealed in a Ziploc bag, I hope, so it didn't stink up your fridge?
No, there wasn't any Ziploc bag, no.
Oh, Christ, really? Oh, my God.
One of the things that I was wondering about is I noticed that a lot of the girls, at least in the neighborhoods, in the writing, they're referred to as strawberries. What is that, and where exactly does that come from? Do you know?
Well, I know that it was a police term used in the 80s, and it was basically women, who exchanged sex for drugs, but I don't know how they got strawberry out of it. Like, I just know that's what the term means, but I don't know why, who came up with strawberry.
Okay, I was just curious. It struck me as a bit strange.
Yeah. Well.
Yeah, I know.
So let's talk a little bit about the task force that was formed in the 2000s that eventually would help catch Lonnie. Normally, task forces are created by police departments and they stir up a lot of dust and then nothing seems to really come from it. Why was this